sketchbook hit the kitchen floor so hard the spine cracked. 43 pages of client work, mood boards, hand-lettered concepts, 2 logo sets I'd been refining for 3 weeks. My father-in-law stood over it like he dropped a piece of junk mail. "You're not working," he said. "You're playing. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 31 years old, and until 9 months ago, I shared a house with my husband's parents. I want to tell you exactly what happened, because people always ask how I stayed so calm at the end. The truth is, I wasn't calm. I was just done. My husband Cole and I met in college. He was an engineering student with a quick laugh and a habit of fixing things that weren't broken. I was studying graphic design, freelancing small jobs out of my dorm room to cover textbook costs. We got serious fast. When we got engaged 2 years later, his parents flew in from Tucson to celebrate. His mother, Beverly, hugged me so tight I thought she'd crack a rib. His father, Gerald, shook my hand firmly and said, "Welcome to the family." I believed him. The housing situation started as a conversation over dinner. Cole's parents were getting older. His father had a knee surgery coming up. The recovery would be long, and their house in Tucson wasn't set up for limited mobility. Cole suggested they stay with us temporarily in Portland, just through the surgery, just until his dad could handle the stairs again. 3 months, maybe 4. I said yes. Of course I said yes. They were his parents. That was a year and a half before the sketchbook hit the floor. What I didn't understand then, and what I spent 18 months slowly learning, was that Beverly and Gerald had a very specific idea of what a daughter-in-law was supposed to be. Beverly communicated it through soft suggestions. Gerald communicated it through silence and stares. Together, they were a system I didn't know I was inside until the walls were already built around me. It started small. Beverly would come into the kitchen while I was cooking and rearrange things. Not dramatically, just the cutting board moved 2 inches, the colander stacked differently. She never said anything. She'd just do it and walk away, and I'd stand there wondering if I was being corrected or if I was imagining it. That kind of thing has a way of making you distrust your own perception. Gerald would walk past my studio, the second bedroom I'd converted into a workspace, and glance in with this expression I still can't fully describe. Not contempt exactly, more like confusion. Like he was looking at a dog that had learned to use a fork. One afternoon, he stopped in the doorway and watched me work for a full 30 seconds without saying anything. Then he said, "Cole's home by 6, what's for dinner?" and walked away. I want to be honest about Cole here, because the comments always find ways to make him simple. Either he's a villain or he's a victim. The truth is messier. Cole loved me. I believe that. But Cole had also grown up in that house, with those parents, and there were certain grooves in his thinking so old he didn't even know they were there. He never told me to stop working. He never directly took their side. But when I brought it up, he'd get this expression, tired, slightly pained, and say, "They're just set in their ways, Nora. They're not trying to hurt you." And then he'd change the subject. I tried to set a boundary early. I really did. About 4 months in, after Beverly had reorganized my pantry while I was on a client call, I sat her down and said as directly as I could that my studio and my kitchen were my spaces, and I'd appreciate her leaving them as she found them. Beverly smiled at me. Not warmly, not coldly, just a flat, polished smile. "Of course," she said. "I only wanted to help." 2 days later, she moved my design books from the studio shelf to the garage because she said they were collecting dust. When I told Cole, he said, "She probably just didn't think you were using them." That's when I understood that the conversation I kept trying to have wasn't happening. Not because they didn't hear me, because they didn't believe I had the standing to have it. By month 6, I'd started closing my studio door during work hours and putting a small sign on it that just said, "In session." Gerald tried the handle once when I was on a video call with a client. I heard him, saw the handle move, kept talking. He left. At dinner that night, he asked Cole in front of me why the spare room was always locked. Cole said I was working. Gerald nodded slowly, the way people do when they've heard an answer they don't accept. My business, Drawn North Design, had been running for 4 years by that point. Small studio, client-focused, mostly brand identity work for Pacific Northwest restaurants, boutique hotels, independent retail. I'd built the client list through referrals, grinding social media for 2 years, and one very good recommendation from a chef in Bend who'd hired me to design his rebrand and ended up having more industry connections than I realized. I wasn't wealthy, but I was paying half of our mortgage from freelance income, had a solid quarterly retainer with 2 anchor clients, and had just signed a contract with a boutique hotel group that would have been the biggest project of my career up to that point. I did not advertise this to Gerald, partly because it felt like I shouldn't have to, and partly because I'd already learned that any information I gave him would be quietly reframed in a way that minimized it. I once mentioned I had a presentation that afternoon, and he asked if it was one of those online things. I said yes. He nodded and asked if Cole knew I'd be tied up, and whether there was anything in the slow cooker. The sketchbook incident happened on a Thursday in March. I've been working since 7 in the morning on concepts for the hotel group, a major deliverable, 48 hours out from the deadline. The sketchbook was open on the kitchen table because I'd taken a working lunch, and the natural light there is better than in the studio. Gerald came in from outside, set his coffee mug down directly on top of a spread I'd been developing for 2 hours, saw me reach for the book to move it, and said, "You're always at that table." I moved the book. I didn't say anything. I went back to work. 15 minutes later, he came back. I heard him stop behind me. Then he said, "Beverly needs the table for dinner prep." "Dinner's in 4 hours," I said. I didn't look up. She likes to get started early. I closed the sketchbook, stood, picked it up. I was already walking toward the studio when I heard him say it. "You know Cole works hard so you can do your little hobby." I stopped, turned around, looked at him. I said, "It's not a hobby. It's how I pay my half of this mortgage." The silence that followed was about 3 seconds long. Then Gerald reached over, took the sketchbook from where I'd set it on the counter, and dropped it. I don't think he threw it. I think he let it fall with just enough force to make a point. The spine cracked when it hit the floor. He walked out of the kitchen. I stood there for a moment. My hands were very steady. I noticed that and found it strange. I picked up the sketchbook, checked the damage. 2 pages had torn at the binding. The cover had bent, and I walked into the studio and closed the door. I didn't cry. I opened my laptop, went into my client portal, and submitted the 48-hour deliverable 4 hours early. Then I sent a short email to the hotel group's project manager, asking if we could move our review call up to the following morning. She said yes. That night Cole and I were in bed and he asked how my day was. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you say something to set him off?" I turned off my lamp. I didn't answer. But in the dark I lay there and thought about that question for a long time. Did I say something to set him off? 4 years of building my own business, 4 years of paying my own way. Did I say something? I started keeping records the next day. Nothing dramatic, just a notes app on my phone. Date, time, what was said, who was present. I've been a designer long enough to know that documentation is a form of power. You can feel wronged in the moment and have it fade into ambiguity. Written down, it stays exact. 2 weeks of entries, then a month, then 6 weeks. What I found, reading back through them, was a pattern even clearer than I felt it in real time. Gerald never said anything about my work when Cole was in the room. Every comment, every look, every helpful suggestion about my schedule or my priorities, it happened when Cole was at his office job or in the garage or asleep. I had suspected this. Seeing it logged made my chest feel strange, like I'd solved the puzzle I hadn't wanted to finish. I also, around this time, had a conversation with my accountant about the hotel group contract. It was a $60,000 engagement over 8 months. First installment coming in 30 days. I told my accountant I might be looking at some business restructuring and asked her to document the revenue projections clearly in preparation for a formal financial review. She asked if everything was okay. I told her I was just getting organized. Cole didn't know about the hotel contract. I hadn't hidden it. I just hadn't told him yet, the same way I didn't tell him about every client call or invoice. But I decided that evening to keep it that way for a little longer. The moment everything broke open happened on a Sunday. It was early April. Cole had gone for a run. I was in the studio on a call with my main anchor client, going over spring campaign deliverables. The door was closed. The "I in session" sign was up. I had earbuds in. Beverly opened the door without knocking. I held up one finger without breaking my sentence. She stood in the doorway. I could see her in my peripheral vision. Arms folded, weight shifted to one hip. I wrapped up the call in about 3 minutes. Professional, normal, and took the earbuds out. I need you to come help me with the guest room, she said. We're having Cole's cousin visit next weekend and the closet needs reorganizing. I looked at her for a moment. I'm in a work session until 2, I said. I can help after 2. It'll only take 20 minutes. I'll help at 2. Beverly's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a degree colder. You know, she said, Gerald and I have been very patient. We've been in this house 9 months and I've never once asked you for anything. The rewrite of history was so confident it almost impressed me. 9 months of reorganized shelves, redirected dinners, dropped sketchbooks, and she'd never once asked for anything. Beverly, I said, I'm asking you to close the door and let me finish my work. At 2 o'clock, I'll come find you. You're being very unkind, she said. I'm being very clear, I said. She left. But she left the door open. I got up, closed it, turned the lock, and sat back down. I spent 4 minutes just breathing before I could focus again. When Cole came back from his run, Beverly had already talked to him. I could tell by the set of his shoulders when he came to the studio door. He knocked. He always knocked, in fairness, and opened it. Mom says you two had a thing. I was on a client call, I said. She walked in without knocking and wanted me to stop to organize a closet. She said you snapped at her. I told her I'd help at 2 and asked her to close the door. Cole rubbed the back of his neck. She was upset, Nora. So was I. I was in the middle of work. Can you go apologize? It would mean a lot to her. I looked at my husband, at this man I had chosen, at the tiredness in his face that I knew was real, that I knew came from being pulled in 2 directions for 9 months, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very clear. No, I said, I won't apologize for that. He left. I heard him in the kitchen with his mother a few minutes later, his voice low, hers slightly raised. I opened my phone and added an entry to my notes. That evening, I called my attorney. I'd used her twice before, once for a client contract dispute, once for a lease negotiation on a studio space I'd briefly considered. She was sharp and unbothered, and I trusted her. I told her I needed to discuss the situation at home and asked if she had time that week. She said Thursday. I also that night sent Cole a text even though he was in the same house. The text said, I want to talk about your parents' timeline for returning to Tucson. I'd like to plan a real conversation, not an in-the-moment one. Can we schedule something this week? He read it. He didn't respond until the next morning. His response was, I know we need to. Things have been hard. Let's talk Friday. Friday. 6 days away. I spent those 6 days finishing the hotel group deliverable, submitting it and receiving an email from the project manager that said it was, quote, exactly what we were hoping for. I spent the meeting with my attorney, who looked through my notes without expression and then said, this documentation is good. Keep going. I spent them quiet and interior at dinner, answering questions when spoken to and not volunteering more. Gerald seemed to interpret this as submission. I watched him relax over those 6 days, become more expansive, refill his coffee with a lighter step. On Thursday, one day before my planned conversation with Cole, I came home from a coffee meeting with a new prospective client to find my studio rearranged. Not completely, but my filing cabinet had been moved from the window wall to the corner. My mood board corkboard, which held active client materials, had been cleared, the pinned papers stacked in a pile on my desk. And my shelf, the one with my design books and client binders, had been reorganized with the books horizontal instead of vertical, 2 binders removed and placed on the floor. Beverly was in the living room. Gerald was watching television. I stood in the studio doorway for maybe 10 seconds. Then I walked into the living room. Who was in my studio today? I asked. Beverly looked up. I was just tidying. The room was looking cluttered. That corkboard had active client materials on it. Where are the pins? I put them in the little dish on your desk. The papers that were on the board, they were organized. That organization is gone now. They're all in a neat stack. I looked at Gerald. He was watching his show. Gerald, I said. He looked over. Did you know Beverly was going to do this? He shrugged. Actually shrugged, like a teenager, and went back to the television. I turned and went back to my studio. I closed the door. I sat at my desk and I pulled up the client files I needed to reconstruct. I spent 2 hours repinning and reorganizing the corkboard. Somewhere in that second hour, I made a decision. I called Cole at work. He picked up on the second ring. I need you to come home, I said. Is everything okay? I need you to come home, and I need us to have that conversation tonight. Not Friday, tonight. He came home. We sat at the kitchen table. Beverly and Gerald had, perhaps sensing something, gone upstairs. Cole listened while I spoke. I had my phone with the notes pulled up. I went through 6 weeks of documentation calmly and specifically. Dates. Words. The sketchbook. The studio. The call. The reorganized room today. Cole was quiet for a long time after I finished. I didn't know it was this consistent, he said finally. I know, I said. That's why I wrote it down. I should have seen more of this. Yes, another silence. Then, what do you want to do? I told him I wanted his parents to set a departure date and to move back to Tucson. I told him I wanted a real timeline, not another a few more months. I told him I wasn't asking him to choose between us. I was asking him to be a husband, which meant having a conversation with his parents that was hard and honest. And I told him that if he needed a few days to process, I understood, but I needed a commitment that the conversation would happen. Cole nodded slowly. Okay, he said. I'll talk to them tomorrow. What I had not yet told him was the other thing, the full picture. I decided to show him. I opened my laptop on the kitchen table and pulled up my business dashboard. Revenue, contracts, projections, the hotel group engagement, now active, the anchor client retainers, the accountant's formal financial summary. Cole looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. Nora, he said finally, this is significant. It's been significant for a while, I said. I just didn't make a point of it. I watched him sit with that. Watch him understand what it meant. Not just the money, but what the money meant. That the mortgage we'd been paying together hadn't been his income carrying mine along. That I had been a full partner financially, invisibly, while his father asked him every Sunday if dinner was handled. Did you know, I said carefully, that your father invested in a friend's landscaping business last year? $12,000 as a silent partner. Cole looked up. How do you know that? Beverly mentioned it once, in passing, about 6 months ago. She was proud of him. I just remembered it. What does that have to do with nothing? I said. I just wanted to know if you knew. I paused. He never asked me a single question about my business, not one. But he has opinions about what it is. Cole didn't answer that, but I watched it land. The conversation Cole had with his parents the next morning lasted 45 minutes. I was in my studio with the door closed. I could hear voices but not words. At one point Beverly's voice rose and then went quiet. At another I heard the back door open and close, Gerald stepping outside, which he did when he was agitated. Cole knocked on my studio door at 11:15. He came in and sat in the chair I kept near the window. They're going home in 3 weeks, he said. Okay, my dad he's upset. He says you've been cold and unwelcoming. I documented what I experienced, I said. You can share that with him if it would help. Cole rubbed his face. He's not going to apologize. I know. Does that matter to you? I thought about it genuinely. Less than I expected, I said. The 3 weeks were uncomfortable but functional. Beverly and I were polite. Gerald and I barely spoke, which felt like its own kind of relief. Cole moved through the house carefully, like someone navigating a room where furniture had been rearranged in the dark. He was trying. I saw that. The morning they left, I made coffee. Beverly came into the kitchen while I was doing it, and we stood next to each other for a moment in silence. Then she said, I hope things get easier for you. It was the closest she came to anything. I handed her a cup and said, Safe travels. I meant it. Gerald loaded the car without coming back inside. Cole walked them out. I stood at the window and watched the rental car back out of the driveway. Then I went to my studio, sat at my desk, and opened a new project file. The hotel group's second phase had just kicked off. A restaurant in Astoria had reached out about a full rebrand. My inbox had 3 new inquiries I hadn't had time to answer. That evening Cole came and stood in the studio doorway, just like Gerald used to, but differently. He knocked first, and he asked, Can I see what you're working on? I turned the monitor toward him. We spent an hour talking about it. He asked real questions. I showed him the hotel group's brief and the concepts I'd been developing. At one point he said, "This is genuinely beautiful, Nora," and I believed him, and it hit me harder than I expected, because I realized how long I'd been working in that room without anyone in the house knowing what I was doing, or why it mattered. There was still a lot to work through between us. The months of him deflecting, of choosing the path that created the least friction in the short term, of asking me if I'd said something to set his father off, that was its own conversation, and we were in it for weeks. But the house was mine again. The table was mine. The door I could close and the door I could open, mine. A few months later, I got a message through my studio's Instagram from a woman in Seattle. She said she'd seen a thread online about a Portland designer who'd kept working through a tough living situation and built something real, and she wanted to know if I was taking new clients. She'd found me through a post her friend had shared, something about setting boundaries in your own workspace. The post had gotten some traction apparently. I didn't know what thread she meant. I still don't exactly. But I wrote her back and she became a client, and her project was one of my favorites that year. The sketchbook I repaired with Japanese tissue paper and linen tape. It's on my shelf now next to my newest one. The cracked spine held. Most things, if you want them to, will. I still think about the sketchbook sometimes. Not with anger. That part faded faster than I expected. I think about it because of what it represented to Gerald and what it actually was. To him, it was proof of something small. To me, it was 3 weeks of client work, a deadline I met early anyway, and the foundation of a business that was quietly paying for the house he was living in for free. The gap between those two realities is where the whole story lived. What I learned, not quickly and not without cost, is that other people's perception of your work is not a verdict on your work. Gerald never asked me a single question about what I did, not one. He formed his entire opinion from the outside. From the image of a woman at a kitchen table with a sketchbook, and that image confirmed something he'd already decided. I used to want to correct that. I used to think that if I just explained it clearly enough, showed him the right numbers, used the right words, he'd revise his view. That's not how that kind of belief works. It doesn't update on evidence. It updates on power, and sometimes not even then. What actually changed things wasn't an argument. It was documentation. It was the quiet, unglamorous work of writing down dates and words and keeping a record that stayed exact when memory wanted to soften everything into ambiguity. That took a particular kind of discipline, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that feels good in the moment, but the kind that requires you to stay level when everything in you wants to either explode or give up. I'm not naturally that person. I had to become her, a little at a time, over 18 months. I think about Cole, too. About the moment I turned the laptop screen toward him at the kitchen table and watched him actually see, maybe for the first time, what I had built, he said it was significant. He was right. But what I kept thinking afterward was, I had never hidden it. The information was always there. He just hadn't looked. Because looking would have required him to hold two things at once, his parents' version of me and the actual version. That's harder than it sounds. Most of us resist it when we can. What this whole stretch of my life taught me is that integrity, real integrity, not the bumper sticker kind, means doing the work honestly even when no one in your house believes the work is real. It means building something true even when the people closest to you have already decided what you are. And it means knowing the difference between staying patient because you're strategic and staying patient because you're afraid. I was both at different points. Only one of them served me. The sketchbook is on my shelf now, repaired with Japanese tissue and linen tape. I kept it on purpose, not as a reminder of what Gerald did. I don't need that, but as a reminder that the things worth building take longer than people expect, survive more than people predict, and belong entirely to you.